Good evening. I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of you for your support during these last difficult months since the tragic passing of LuxFLAG's general manager, Sachin Venkalas. Sachin was a great human being and a tireless supporter of sustainable finance, and he exemplified LuxFLAG with his passion, ambition, and drive to move to a sustainable future. Thank you. As chairwoman of LuxFLAG, I'm very pleased to see that after 2 editions, the LuxFLAG Sustainable Investment Week has already gained recognition. And that is thanks to LuxFLAG's associate members who are showcasing this week where they are in the sustainable finance journey. And given the finance industry is at different stages of that journey, this week is all about sharing best practices so we advance all of us towards the goal of making all finance sustainable. For this 3rd edition of the LSIW, we thank you for such a positive response with over 3,500 registrations, which is pretty amazing. And I'd like to thank our host partners and media partners and our speakers, of course. The 25 sessions over the week cover the latest trends and the most pressing issues in sustainable finance. And we certainly hope you find them useful and find inspiration in the progress being made, but also that needs to be made to harness finance to find solutions to our current environmental and social challenges. There's 2 points of housekeeping. The slides and the recording of the sessions are made available to you in a week or so. And we do have a Q&A possibility if we have time to get to those today. Please click the 3 dots at the bottom right of your screen. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's last session. It's the LuxFLAG session featuring the European Court of Auditors and their recently published special report on sustainable finance. We're very honored that the court is featured at LSIW in order to bring this really very, again, important report to the attention of all of our members and attendees. We're also very honored to have with us today Ms. Eva Lindström, a member of the court, to present the results of the report. A final honor is the presence of our distinguished panelists, His Excellency Pierre Gramegna, Luxembourg Finance Minister, and Ms. Julie Becker, CEO of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. And they'll join Ms. Lindström in debating how the points raised in the report can be addressed by the public and private sectors. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce Ms. Lindström, who's been a member of the European Court of Auditors since taking up the role in early 2018. Prior to joining the European Court of Auditors, she had a number of roles in the Swedish Public Service, in the Ministry of Finance as Auditor General, and as State Secretary to the Minister for Enterprise and Innovation. So again, Ms. Lindström, many thanks for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Denise, and good afternoon, everyone. And of course, it's a great pleasure for me to present our report on sustainable finance and also to participate in today's panel discussion together with Minister Gramegna and Ms. Julie Becker. And although we meet virtually, all of our institutions are located here in the heart of Luxembourg, so I think it feels great to join here today. As many of our participants come from the private sector, let me just say a few words on what we do at the Court of Auditors. We are the independent external auditor of the European Union, and as EU auditors, we work to improve EU administration and financial management and to promote accountability and transparency. The court performs financial compliance and performance audits, and our main auditee is the Commission. So we audit the Commission and also the implementation of the EU budget. But of course, we also follow the money and what is happening in the member states. And of course, the main question is money being well spent? Coming to our today's main topic, the area of sustainability and climate change has become one of the European Court of Auditors' top priorities, actually, and we have produced several reports on topics related to the environment and climate. But actually, this is the first report that we have done on sustainable finance. And we have prepared a short PowerPoint presentation, so I hope my Andre will help me to share the slides. I could just start by saying that I think this summer has once more shown the urgency of the climate crisis. I mean, from the floods and fires across different European countries, it's clear that there is an urgent need not just to mitigate climate change, but also to adopt it. I think many of us is also aware of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was published this summer and also highlighted that unfortunately such events that happened this summer will only become more frequent. And of course, this was also an important starting point for this report. Are we getting any slides on the presentation? Andre?
I have shared it. Was this visible? I'm sorry, because I
No,
shared it.
it's not visible.
No, unfortunately not.
Could someone then on your side share it, please?
Yeah, I passed the rights to you, Denise.
The sharing button has disappeared for some reason.
Okay.
Sorry.
Could you pass the sharing button back to Andre? I don't have the slides. Tim, please pass the sharing button back. Thank you.
That's what I did.
Okay.
Here we go. Thank
Yeah,
you.
great.
Thank you for your patience.
Okay, so this was what I mentioned, recent events, and I think we are all aware that this summer really highlighted and reminded us on the situation where we're in. Another starting point, we can take the next slide, is what we call the investment gap. And I think it's clear that in order to adapt to the effects of climate change and to limit greenhouse gas emission, we need to invest, and we need to invest a lot. To achieve the 2050 net zero emission target in Europe, experts estimate that we need to spend almost 1 trillion euros investment each year on climate action. And this does not include the cost of adapting to climate change. And the EU spending on climate action is planned to be roughly 200 billion euros each year until 2027. That is what we know so far. So I think it's clear to say that public spending will not be enough, and the investment gap will need to be filled both by other public investment, also by private and institutional capital. So our main question in this report was whether the Commission has been taking the right actions to redirect finance towards sustainable investment, and we focused on 3 different areas. Firstly, we looked at the Commission's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. Secondly, we also looked at the role of the European Investment Bank, and thirdly, whether the EU budget is following sustainable finance good practice. And I think it's fair to say that this is quite a complex, evolving area, and it has also been very much of a moving target. And just in July, and as some of you might know, the Commission published its new sustainable finance strategy, which of course we also took into account. So let me start by saying a few words on what is the problem today. Why doesn't private sector invest sufficiently into sustainable investment? And I think it's fair to say that sustainability has maybe become a bit of a buzzword, and many companies and also institutional investors claim to be taking steps towards transforming their companies into more sustainable ones. But capital continues to flow towards unsustainable activities. And I think you could say that unsustainable activities are still a bit too profitable. And we have what we as economists could call sort of market failures. First, the products that we buy today and the price we pay for investments do not fully reflect the cost and impact that they have on society. For example, the harm done by greenhouse gas emissions is not fully reflected in cost for companies or for consumers. Second, there is currently not enough transparency and disclosure on what is actually sustainable and what is not. And together with unreliable and incomparable data, the lack of sufficient transparency and disclosure remains a serious obstacle in changing investors' behavior. A third reason is the changes in legal and political and technological environment can increase the risk of sustainable investment. They can have higher risk or cost, at least in the short term, and require public support to be financially viable. And finally, experts and stakeholders will talk to us. So where are the projects we can invest in? We would like to do more of sustainable investment, but we can't find the projects. Please show us the list. So obviously there seems to be a lack of clarity on sustainable investment needs and also available projects. So these 4 reasons were also an important starting point when we looked at whether the Commission had taken the right actions. This is a slide on the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, and I think all these challenges that I mentioned were already highlighted by the 2018 report of the so-called high-level expert group on sustainable finance that was established by the Commission. And their report formed actually the basis of the Commission's action plan on sustainable finance and was, of course, also an important starting point for the audit. I will not go into the details here, just to say that the Commission's action plan focused quite a lot on transparency. And of course, the key measure on this was the recent EU taxonomy. And the action plan also includes measures that financial institutions should consider sustainability when providing advice, when offering financial products, or when reporting on their activities. So there was a lot of different aspects and different points in this action plan. So now to our findings. Our audit shows that there's definitely a lot going on. And as I said earlier, this has been a bit of a moving target. The Commission has definitely done a lot, and it has rightly focused on making transparent what is sustainable and what is not. And the key measure, as I said, of this is the recent EU taxonomy with its do no significant harm principle, as well as its detailed criteria. But this has not been accompanied by measures to fully address the cost of unsustainable economic activities. And the EU actions on sustainable finance will not be fully effective unless additional measures are taken to price in the environmental and social cost of unsustainable activities. And that is, for example, the greenhouse gas emission is still not fully reflected in business decisions. We also found that many actions suffer delays, such as the EU taxonomy criteria on climate change or guidelines on how financial institutions should advise their clients on sustainability. And as you all know, the EU taxonomy is also not yet finished. The question whether nuclear and gas can be classified as sustainable is still outstanding and will be part of a negotiation. So this was for the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And looking at the EIB, in our report, we highlight the important role that the European Investment Bank has when it comes to supporting sustainable finance. And between 2012 and 2021, the EIB financed nearly 200 billion euros of sustainable investment. And the EIB also checks environmental and social aspects of projects, doing the sort of the due diligence so that other investors are willing to go into the investment. And doing the due diligence, they're also reducing to some extent the transaction costs for other investors. So, and also that the EIB plans to apply the EU taxonomy. As some of you might know, we do have quite a limited mandate when it comes to the EIB. We can only audit what is guaranteed or financed by the EU budget. And that is why we looked at the European Fund for Strategic Investment, that is called EFSI, which is managed by the EIB. And we found that EFSI did not focus on where sustainable investment is most needed. Of the investment projects on climate action, few such investments were being carried out in Central and Eastern Europe, where experts see the biggest need. Only around 5% went to this region. So one could therefore ask if we really get the most bang for the buck, where we don't invest in those regions, in those countries, where the effect on climate would be the highest per spent euro. Another finding when it comes to EIB is that most findings went on mitigation projects, and only little, not even 4%, went to climate change adaptation projects, such as flood defenses, for example. And I think recent events have shown that climate change is already here, and we need to have investment also in adaptation, and of course also to sort of redirect private capital into these kind of projects, which could be a bit challenging, because I think it's important to find a business model that makes these kind of projects interesting for private investments. For example, they should be sort of bankable, or you should have to create some kind of a cash flow. So that's for EIB. Let us now shift our attention to the EU budget and the next generation EU. And this is just a slide to remind us of sort of the size of the spending of the coming years. We have the regular multi-annual financial framework with 1,074 billion euros. And then we have the next generation, which is 750 billion euros in the coming 7 years. Looking at the EU budget, we know that approximately 30%, that is the regular part, is planned for climate action, but the EU budget still lacks consistent science-based criteria to avoid significant harm to the environment. It does not consistently apply the do no significant harm principle to all of EU expenditure. For example, it's not applied when it comes to the common agriculture policy. In practice, this means that the EU can fund harmful activity, and the EU in some cases continues also to fund fossil fuel infrastructure such as gas pipelines. In agriculture, which accounted for nearly 40% of the EU budget in the last multi-annual financial framework, emissions are not going down, and several measures actually increases emissions. In our report, we also show that procedures for tracking EU budget contribution to climate objectives are not as strict and science-based as EU taxonomy. So there are different shades of green being used in the EU budget. Looking a bit to the future, next generation EU. So what about the EU Recovery Fund? We published an opinion on this fund last year, and we, of course, acknowledged the need for a quick and decisive action, but we also highlighted risk. And I think one could say that the next generation EU could, of course, be a great opportunity to focus the recovery on climate and digitalization. But I think one question is, will it really be green, and how green will it actually be? It's said that 37% should go to climate action. This is around 268 billion euros, so it's a lot of money. For the whole of the next generation or the recovery fund, there is the obligation of applying the do no significant harm principle. But how this will be applied is very much up to the individual member states. And there is no obligation to use the EU taxonomy. Under the RRF, the member states may also still support fossil fuel investment exceptionally. In addition, the RRF also lacks common indicators across all member states, which, at least how it looks today, will make it quite difficult to monitor and also audit spending on the green transition. So it's an opportunity, but we also see big risks and also difficulties to actually see how much has actually been spent on green transition, and also what were the impact of these investments. So coming now to the conclusions and the recommendations, we conclude that in order to redirect private and public finance towards sustainable investment, more consistent EU action is required. And our main recommendations are for the Commission. First, to complete the measures of the action plan. As I said, I think there will be some negotiations, but I think it's important that this will not be a very long procedure. So finish the action plan. Second, to identify additional measures to ensure that the pricing of greenhouse gas emission better reflects the environmental cost. And we know that as a part of this Fit for 55 package, the Commission proposed to extend the EU ETS to road transport and building sector, and also tightening the rules for aviation. It's also proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism to make sure production does not just sort of move abroad when emission targets are less stringent. But I think it's important to remind us that these additional measures could be very important, but at the moment they are just proposals. Regarding the EU budget, we recommend a consistent application of the do no significant harm principle and also the EU taxonomy criteria. And last but not least, we also recommend to take a more proactive approach to sustainable project development. And the Commission should focus its new advisory service, what that is called the InvestEU Advisory Hub, to areas and sectors with high sustainable investment needs, but low capacity to mount such projects by themselves. And I think also it's important that the member states should also better use their national energy and climate plans to identify their needs in sustainable investment. So those were our conclusions and our recommendations, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Lindström. Yes, indeed, it was very interesting and a very clear presentation of the court's findings and the need, amongst other things, for the EU Commission to better target sustainable investment opportunities. And I also very much appreciated a comment that you made in the press release for the report, which was unsustainable business is still too profitable. And it's in the report, obviously. I think that's a very unfortunately true statement. And we have a lot of work to do still. So I'd like to move to the next part of our session, panel session, where Ms. Lindström will be joined by His Excellency Pierre Gramagna, Luxembourg Minister of Finance, and Julie Becker, CEO of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. So Minister Gramagna hardly needs an introduction to this audience, but I will give him one anyway. As a career diplomat, he's held a number of posts in Europe, North America, and Asia. In Asia, including he was Luxembourg's ambassador to Japan and South Korea. He held the post of Director General at the Chamber of Commerce until his appointment to the government as Minister of Finance in 2013. And following the elections of 2018, he was reappointed Minister of Finance. Ms. Julie Becker, trained as a lawyer, joined the Stock Exchange in Luxembourg in 2013, where she was quickly appointed to the Executive Committee. She founded the Luxembourg Green Exchange, or LGX as it's known, in 2016, so it's a significant achievement, and was also a member of the EU High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance from 2016 to 2018. Julie was appointed recently as CEO of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange in April. And I, of course, have to mention that she represents the Stock Exchange as a charter member of LuxFLAG and sits on our board. So thank you for that, Julie. So I have questions that I'll address to one of the panelists in particular in the first instance, but of course the other panelists are more than welcome to add their comments. And at the end of the session, I'll ask each panelist to make a short closing remark. So first question is for Minister Gramagna. What do you consider to be the most important recommendations in the report to increase the speed and the magnitude of the public and private finance towards sustainable investments? And maybe in particular, what can EU member states do in that respect? And specifically, how can national energy and climate plans be accelerated? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise, for the introduction and also for chairing LuxFLAG now for quite some time, and in particular in the wake of the passing away of Sachin Vankalas. And I must say that very sad that he passed away, and at the same time I think the message he leaves is of a double nature. The very first one is that LuxFLAG has prospered in the time where he was the CEO, and second, that we should not take COVID on the light shoulder, and he has paid a very high price for that, and I think we owe him that we take the whole thing very seriously also in the future, and encourage all the people around us, with all due respect to everyone's freedom of mind, that getting vaccinated is good for yourself, is especially good for the people you are working with or live with, and in the end is good for society and good for the country. And just thinking of Sachin confirms that. I would like to thank Eva Lindström for her report, which I found quite interesting, and the summary of it really very much very convincing, I would say, in highlighting lots of things that we need to do. So we have a homework, all of us, which is in fact staggering. And the homework has this incredible challenge that it is a task for the whole world, for the planet, and there are so many actors at multilateral level, the IFIs, the international finance institutions on the one side, the United Nations itself with the Sustainable Development Goals and so on and so on, and then first and foremost, especially in Europe, the European Union. Fortunately, we have the European Union, otherwise I don't even know how we would go about this. Imagine if we wouldn't have the European Union. We would have 27 countries looking for rules and standards and not being able to really get organized. So let's be happy about the fact that we can at least discuss it at 27. Now, one can find that we are not going fast enough, but I can confirm to you, and Eva knows that, and Julie and you, Denise, too, that Europe is ahead of the others in this area. But that doesn't mean that we're very far, even if we're very much ahead. You asked me what the biggest challenges are for at each level. It's very difficult to summarize it all. Let me try to be as grasping as possible. First, we need to mobilize capital. In parallel, we need to know for what we want to use it, certainly more adaptation measures than just mitigation. And third, we need to have a framework and rules. This supposes that we all agree that we need to adjust to climate change, which I now take for granted, because I think the pandemic has shown us that climate skeptics are wrong. And there are still out there people that are climate skeptics, but we've had a life-size test worldwide that when you slow down the economy, then the rivers become clearer, the air becomes better, and the planet is in better shape. So there's no doubt that human activity is key in order to avoid the warming of the planet. Now, I was struck by the fact that at the OECD ministerial meeting, which I attended last week, people were not using the word climate change anymore. They all talked about climate crisis. And this has happened in a few months because it has become so obvious to all of us that we are already in the middle of the crisis. This is new. So it's not any measures to adapt is key, yes, more important even than mitigation, but there we were still in a reasoning of change of climate. I think now there's a kind of realization that there is a climate crisis. Eva, who is at European Court of Auditors, has certainly noticed that we had floodings of a nature we have never known in Luxembourg this year. In July, at the same time it happened in the Netherlands, in Germany, and fortunately we had no victims in Luxembourg, but the damage is enormous. We had a tornado last year. We knew tornadoes only in the United States in the past, and so on and so on. So I can make a long list. So what can we do as Europe? I think that, for me, is the priority. Whatever we can do in Europe, we should do at European level, because we can be a trendsetter, a standard maker, and a flag bearer. And that has happened already to a certain extent in the past, and I wish and I hope and I'm confident that we can do that also in the weeks and years to come. I see two big risks, which I'm going just now to mention. Maybe I'll have time and we have time to come back on it. One is the greenwashing and the other one is the stranded assets. The greenwashing, because it doesn't help the climate. If we just paint in green, whatever investments we do, we're not helping the planet. We're lying to ourselves and we are offending the planet. And the stranded assets issue is we can only organize portfolios over time and we need time to adjust. Senator Kerry, whom I met in Paris last week in the ministerial meeting, said I suppose the number is right, that we still had subsidies in the world last year worth $340 billion for fossil fuel subsidies. In the meantime, developed countries have promised €100 billion to less developed countries or emerging countries to help them cope with climate change. So you see the disproportion there is still enormous. And as Eva rightly highlighted, if in the European Recovery Fund we're still allowing on an exceptional basis countries to still fund fossil fuel, is obviously not the right thing to do. All this has to do with compromise and so on. But you see that we have still a long road ahead there. So that's, I think, the two key issues in implementation that we need to keep in mind: avoid greenwashing and avoid the stranded assets issue. In order to do that, we need a framework, we need a taxonomy. Also in that, Europe is ahead of the pack by having laid on the table before others a framework. That's quite a progress, but as Eva also rightly pointed out, it has not been spelled out to the full. And I think there's a large consensus that fossil fuels should be obviously excluded. On the natural gas, there's also some consensus, probably that will take a little bit longer. And then there's obviously opposition on nuclear energy. So these two last issues needs to be agreed. So that's a big issue for me, the taxonomy, the framework. And the other one, and I'll finish by then to leave time for others, is the pricing of CO2. How do we price CO2? And this would deserve on its own a conference and experts, and I'm not, but the challenges this entails are enormous. Because for the time being, we are not able to measure how much CO2 emissions there is in a pot of yogurt, or there is in a car, or there is in a computer chip. And as long as we cannot measure that with standards that we more or less agree to, at least in Europe, it's very difficult to take decisions. We have some ideas in Europe, I'm not going to dwell on it. How to go about is in fact inspiring ourselves from the emissions trading system. But this is the way we look at it. Other countries look at it outside the European Union in another fashion. And last week, the OECD suggested that the OECD could eventually serve as the place where we gather all the information in order to have a standard or standards or a framework that would be acceptable more or less for the whole world. And in fact, and that would be my final remark, the reasoning of the OECD is the following, saying we've been successful in organizing and finding compromise for 140 countries in taxation. It was announced last Friday. And so we, in the OECD inclusive format, 140 countries roughly have agreed to the Pillar 1, Pillar 2 approach on taxation. We need such an endeavor, such a project for emissions and for the CO2 pricing. This is a very, very complicated issue, and I think the European Union must be interested in such an idea being implemented. But in the same time, in parallel, we must continue our work on our side and not be slowed down. But you see that this is quite a challenge to make both things, collect all the data that exists all over the world, other projects around the world in how to measure it. In the United States, for example, it's done bottom up. In Europe, it's done top down with the taxonomy. How we find a common denominator there lies a little bit ahead in the future. I hope I've not been too technical in what I said and that I was clear. But so in summary, what I would say is we need a way to measure CO2 content and do a CO2 pricing. Europe needs to push ahead on its own and hope to have others tag along And third, and I will not go into details, we need to crowd in the private sector, which the European Investment Bank is doing, which we in Luxembourg are doing together with the European Investment Bank, and countries themselves obviously need to use more green bonds or sustainability bonds, like Luxembourg has done recently last year by issuing the first sustainability bond in the world as a AAA country. That would be it for the time being. Back to you, Denise.
Thank you, Minister Gramegna. But that's a very good lead in to asking Julie if she has any comments. Speaking of green bonds. Thank you. Oops. While Julie gets organized, I would also, there we go. Perfect.
Sorry.
No worries.
Sorry, some
yours.
difficulty today to connect. So what to add? Difficult to add anything specific on this. Maybe just to echo what Minister Gramegna just said about indeed the pragmatic, I think, and efficient approach which is needed to carbon pricing, which I think will be discussed at length at COP26, and which need to be clearly differentiated depending on needs and sector. So clearly, adequate carbon pricing must play a central role in driving decarbonization, especially of the harder to abate sectors like steel, trucking, aviation, and shipping, of course. But maybe to add on this, what could European member states do is so I think there's a need of regulation also around energy efficiency, which has been a key driver of improvements, especially in the automotive industry, as we saw, but also what we need as well is regulation around greener fuel mandates, which could, for instance, require airlines and ship operators to use a rising percentage of zero carbon fuels. So incentives also would be needed to continue to drive this agenda. Maybe also for end investors or end users, a regulation to show the carbon intensity of consumer product would clearly help raising awareness and educate also end consumer. There's also clearly a need for public support for infrastructure development, like Minister Gramegna just mentioned, through Luxembourg sustainability bonds, which use of proceeds help to finance green transportation. It was also the case of the Thailand sustainability bond, where also the use of proceeds were partially used for rapid transition lines for electric trains. And public support would also be needed and support the research and development and the deployment for new technologies. But as it was mentioned, public funds are not enough, and we clearly need to mobilize massive amount of private capitals as well. So private sector action will be so vital to achieve full decarbonization of harder to abate sectors. And I think what's important is that those sectors will also need to develop their own roadmaps to the net zero and cross-sector initiative. And they need to develop partnership and potentially to issue indeed green bonds to be able to finance their transition.
Thank you, Julie. I don't know, Ms. Lindstrom, is there anything you wanted to add to that, or if not, I can move on to the next question. It's up to you.
No, I think there were very, very good comments all, and I think we all agree on that. It's important to create the right incentives to sort of internalize these decisions to the companies and also to investors. So as we underlined in the report, the pricing of carbon emission and also other sort of harmful activities, that is maybe the most important. I think also what Minister Gramegna said on greenwashing, of course, that is also extremely important, not least when it comes to the role of auditors, both the public auditors, but also the private auditors, and maybe I can come back on that question. I think also when it comes to the sort of the question of the stranded assets, of course, we are all aware of that this is very much about transition. We want to move from point A to point B, and will we do this in an orderly manner, or will it be more sort of chaotic? And I think, I mean, there will definitely be stranded labor in some parts of Europe, and there might also be stranded assets. The question is, are some of these
stranded assets or stranded labor?
So I think that is a very important and vital question, really. How will this transition be done? But I think for Europe, also taking sort of a kind of, and that is also what Minister Gravenia referred to, taking a political leadership in this. I think it's important to send a signal to the private sector that this won't go away. This is the direction we will go, and thereby also facilitating for investing more sustainable and investing for the future, really.
Thank you very much. Could I, though, ask you the next question, which is, now that the European Court of Auditors has published the special report on sustainable finance, what happens next, and how do you see the role of auditors in this?
Yes, thank you very much. Now, I think when it comes to our role, I mean, now this report is published, although we are sort of, the name is the court, we're not the court, we don't make sort of decisions, we give recommendations to the Commission. So I think now it's up to the Commission, and so of course also up to the Parliament to sort of put pressure on the Commission, but also for the Council. And I'm very also happy to be able to make a presentation in the European Parliament, both for the committees for budget control, environment, and the committee, and also the Committee for Economic and Monetary Affairs. And we have also made presentation on the Council on the sort of civil servant level. But I think also this is important that this is discussed also on a political level. And of course, for a country like Luxembourg, which has actually been very much of a forerunner, and not least the stock exchange, I think this is a question that hopefully will be discussed also on a political level. What happens with our report? Well, as I said, we give recommendation, and of course we always follow up and what happens to the recommendation, and also before we publish the report, we have a dialogue with the Commission, and actually they agreed on most of the recommendations. I think the most sort of discussion we had was actually to implement a more science-based sustainability criteria to the EU budget, and they wanted to sort of take that into the next financial regulation, and our approach was that this should be done as quick as possible, not least when it comes to agriculture policy. So I think that is for when it comes to the question of greenwashing and the role of the private auditors. I think now we have a proposal from the Commission on this corporate sustainable reporting directive, which sort of is designed to make sustainable information more detailed, more comparable and credible for investors and other stakeholders. And this is also, of course, on the sort of theme of transparency. And we can see that if this proposal becomes reality, it will sort of widen the amount of, or the number of companies that has to report on this, from some 7,400 up into 50,000 companies and organizations in Europe. And of course, then the role of auditors, I mean, is this information on sustainability, is it trustable? And in the directive, the role of auditors is to some extent clarified, and they should give a sort of a limited assurance, saying that we haven't found anything else, of course. But I think the next step would, of course, be auditors that really can give assurance to this information. And I think for our sort of profession, or for the audit society, this will be a bit of a challenge, because that demands that we don't only sort of stick to the figures or even sort of efficiency and effectiveness, but also that we have the knowledge on how does different aspects of the business affect climate, and also the other way around, how does climate change, or the climate crisis, as the minister put it, how does that affect the core business of the different companies? So I think for our profession, it will make life more challenging, but on the other hand, also more interesting. And I think the question of greenwashing is really important, because if we want the companies to report, if we want to give this sort of information, not only to investors, but also to consumers, of course, the information has to be trustable.
Absolutely agree. Thank you. Julie, yes?
If I may add, I completely agree with that. The fact that quality and safeguards are really key for the moment, indeed, and the role of external auditors is really crucial. in all frameworks being developed, and it has become really a key recommendation. So recently in the updated green bond principles from the International Capital Market Association, which made both frameworks and the external review mandatory. So for new innovative products like sustainability-linked bond, there's not only a second opinion, which is recommended for pre-issuance, but also the external review is mandatory for post-issuance review. And lastly, in the EU Green Bond Standard, which is about to be released, hopefully, now all EU green bonds will have to be checked by external reviewers in order to ensure the compliance with the EU green bond standards, the taxonomy alignment of funding projects, and the allocation report should also be reviewed by an external auditor. And in addition to that, all these external reviewers should be registered at ESMA level. So this element is more and more present in the market, and I think that well, the role of regulators being to protect and at the same time support is essential for sustainable finance to thrive and to maintain the integrity of the market.
Thank you. And it was a very good point about the need for educating and getting auditors, but not just auditors, up to speed on everything sustainable, if you will. And I suppose if one is telling one's children what profession they should go into, it shouldn't be law or compliance anymore. It should be environmental engineering or the like. But yes, interesting for the future. If I could perhaps just move to one last question, because time is marching on here. Perhaps for Minister Gramegna, you know, more finance is needed, but it's also important to increase, of course, the cooperation between public and private institutions to be successful in mobilizing private capital. So what are some of the ways that those private and public sectors can cooperate in this domain in particular?
Yes, thank you, Denise. Let me also, just before answering that very fast, say that all things that have been said by Eva and Julie, I fully subscribe to, and that it is key that there is external auditors, and they will play an ever-increasing role. Let's not forget that with all the auditing we have to do, not only for green or sustainable, it's thousands and now it's millions and billions of documents to be read. The only way we can solve it is artificial intelligence. Otherwise, we will keep armies in all countries not to do war, but to read data. So that is the link between the green agenda of European Union and the digital one, which is also a transition. But the two things, I think, are very much more interconnected than we think. Having said that, the interconnection of sustainable and climate with digital, let me talk about the interaction between private and public. Now, Angel Gurria, the former Secretary General of the OECD, used to say, we need to go from the billions to the trillions if we want to really adjust to climate change and climate crisis, and I think he was totally right. So I can give you one example, so to be very pragmatic, of what Luxembourg had started with European Investment Bank 3-4 years ago. We have done an international climate finance platform, which the goal of which it is to de-risk projects. In other words, we have mobilized 150 million euro and together with the EIB, and we take this senior tranche. That means we take the first risk of loss, and thanks to that, the EIB and private players finance projects which otherwise would not have been bankable. That means, because that's the whole philosophy of the European Investment Bank, is not development aid, it's making projects that are bankable, where the funds that are being invested are being reimbursed. So I think that's a very interesting product of blended finance of a modern age. And we could do that much more, I think, in climate change issues, especially for emerging countries which have a lot of potential. Obviously, the poorer the country, you more had to switch to subsidies and so on, and even those are naturally necessary. But how we can organize the de-risking seems to me to be a very precious way. And obviously, we need to mobilize a lot of capital for that. That's why we need the Green Stock Exchange, and we need stock exchange worldwide to play an important role. And last but not least, yes, we need to train the people to be up to date there. It's also quite a challenge, but which brings us back full circle that we also need to agree at world level what the principles are. So with that, we have done a 360-degree coverage, I would say. Back to you.
Thank you. Julie or Ms. Lindstrom, any comments?
Well, maybe one comment about indeed the role of exchanges which have evolved, and also maybe to link this with the report where the generation of sustainable project pipelines was so underlined and where efforts are needed. I think that's where stock exchanges have a role to play by increasing visibility for sustainable development projects, promoting transparency and disclosure efforts from green bond issuers, for instance, and making information available for investors. So stock exchanges have also a role to play in broadening the sustainable finance universe for investors, fostering also innovation, like Minister Gramigna was just mentioning, innovation as well in sustainable finance. So we see new products happening, like the sustainability linked bond I mentioned earlier. But this is a very important new instrument which allow issuers in all industries, as long as they disclose their sustainability strategy and they set clear, measurable, and science-based targets to become more sustainable, they can use those products to also finance their transition. So this development is very important, as it really broadens the scope of sustainable finance instruments, and because there's still a lack of sustainable investment opportunity, as it was also underlined in the report, I think innovation in that kind of product is very important. That's why we are now displaying them on our exchange, the Green Exchange, together, for instance, with climate-aligned issuers bonds. These are companies that derive at least 75% of their revenues from environmentally friendly activities. So all their bonds, whether labeled or not, whether green bond or not, can therefore also be considered as sustainable investment opportunities for investors. Maybe to conclude also on a positive note, like it is mentioned in a report from Energy Transition Commission, mission is still possible. I think I completely agree also with the main message from the report that much more needs still to be done, and I completely agree, and it needs to be done fast. But let's not forget that the trend is also positive. Bloomberg, for instance, estimates that new sustainable debt issuance in 2021 will reach $1 trillion. So things are happening, and public and private sectors, as Minister Gramigna was just mentioning, are coming together across borders, joining forces. So we are seeing a proliferation of sustainability-related commitments, such as net zero, nature positive, regeneration agriculture, even social issues, which is also a very important element of sustainable finance, to have this holistic view of sustainable finance come to the fore with concepts like just transition, diversity and inclusion, but also building back better. So these offer very big opportunities for sustainable investing. And but of course, they will do more harm than good if we fail to set a high bar.
Thank you, Julie. So, Julie, you gave your closing remarks before I asked for them. Thank you very much. That was very efficient of you. Maybe Minister Gramigna, I could just ask you for some brief closing remarks, and then I'll leave the floor to Ms. Lindstrom.
Yes, thank you. With pleasure. I think that I agree with the statement that winning the climate change challenge is still possible. Now, when you think of the TV series, it's called Mission Impossible, and they still managed to do it. So if this is a mission still possible, if you are very nasty, you would say, well, then it's easy. But we all know it's exactly the contrary. There's just a very tiny window of opportunity that we might still able to do it. And this is very serious because experts have told us, and I'm not an expert and I'm not a scientist, that if we miss the goal, it's not a kind of we lose a battle, but it seems that the increase of temperature will become exponential and that we cannot stop it. So in that sense, it really sounds like a James Bond movie and someone who with a laser beam wants to destroy the whole planet. And I think we need to use such images for people who will not read large reports. And we need to tell the people the truth, that there are high risks here, not for the planet, but for ourselves, the human beings. Because if we fail, the planet will survive, but we will not. And the last thing I would like to say is thank you, Denise, not only for organizing this event, but the whole Sustainable Investment Week, and congratulate LuxFLAG for all what has been achieved over the years, and in particular your success, your and your team's success in the last year. Because this is the proof that there is a lot of need for sustainable projects, for assessing them, for measuring them, for having labels, which is what LuxFLAG is doing. And what we see, and that will be my conclusion, is the interconnection between social, environmental, and governance. The ESG label, that is the one that most players ask for, and we have noticed that when we issued the sustainability bond, because the demand was extremely high, and as it was one of the first times that a country and the sovereign would issue such a bond, it was a very good indicator. And I keep from our discussion, and I thank her for that, Eva Lindström, who has quite well say we don't have only an issue of stranded assets, we also have an issue of stranded labor. That's why ESG is key, and we need to avoid the greenwashing. And these three things together, stranded assets, stranded labor, and greenwashing, is the triptych of the transition. We must make sure that we do the three things together, otherwise we will fail. Thanks again.
Thank you, Minister Gramegna. Ms. Lindström?
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the valuable comments. I think this has been very interesting. Maybe this problem with this panel is that we do agree on most things. And I think for me, I mean, it's the transition question really that is the sort of the difficult part. Actually, I'm quite positive when it comes to sort of the amount of capital. We know there's a lot of private capital out there searching for yield, and also having had an environment with negative interest rates. I think there is a possibility actually to make good business out of sustainable investment. And of course, the climate crisis, as Minister Gramegna said, it's already here. So I think really it's about adaptation. Of course, we should keep on fighting sort of the mitigation, of course, as well. But I think also to handle this transition in an orderly way for people who work and for investors, because this will change the way we consume, the way we invest, the way we travel. I think also, Minister Gramegna, you referred to the COVID crisis, and I think the positive thing about this is that it showed that we actually can adopt. We can adopt, and we can adopt quite quickly if we know that the situation is urgent. And I think this sense of urgency that is spreading around now, and I think actually that is quite positive. So thank you again, Denise, for arranging this, and thank you for the opportunity to present the report.
Thank you all so much. Excellent, an excellent speeches, excellent panel, and we could continue, but I know we have lots of work to do. So finally, I'd just like to end the session with a quote that I use for the end of every session, which is, and this is actually Sachin's quote, "We now understand that sustainable finance is not just another type of investment, it's a complete shift of mindset." And so Thank you again, our speakers, Minister Gavenia, Julie Becker, Eva Lindstrom. And this ends the first day of the LuxFLAG Sustainable Investment Week, and I look forward to seeing you, the participants, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to continue the discussion. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Denise.
Thank you.
Bye, Julie.
Thanks.
Bye, Eva. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.